Just waiting for technology to catch up. All right, looks like the technology's up. Looks like Zoom is working. All levels check normal. All of the fun things we have to do. But hey, it gives me a chance to not only teach, but continue to do so throughout this pandemic. So I can't complain too much. But let's get down to our discussion for tonight. Last week, we talked about Medinat Yisrael, the state of Israel, from the beginning of the Zionist movement in the 1800s through to the establishment of Israel as an independent sovereign nation in 1948. We also talked about some of the very early issues in 1948. First, the war for independence, and then also some of the issues regarding the status quo arrangement with the ultra-Orthodox in the country at the time. One of the things I didn't make explicit, although it was there in the Declaration of Independence excerpt that we read, was that Israel also had a status quo arrangement with the non-Jewish population, meaning that Christians were still allowed to be Christians, Muslims were still allowed to be Muslims, Muslims would be in charge of Muslim holy sites, Christians would be in charge of Christian holy sites. That has continued to be the arrangement up until this day. So I just want to make sure we got that caught up from our 1948 excerpt. So we're going to pick up from 1948 going onward. And the first thing we have to do is look internally at the Jewish population of Israel, because you may have gotten the impression from last week's discussion that the internal population of Israel was and is entirely from Eastern European extraction. While it is definitely true that during the Aliyot, the different waves of immigration that happened before 1948, the vast majority of people coming at that time were from Eastern European countries. There were still a healthy number of people coming from Western European or Latin America or North America. And there were also, of course, Israelis, Jews that were becoming Israelis that had already been living in the land of Israel for a couple thousand years, like I tried to explain at the very beginning. They are variously described as either Mizrahi or Sephardi. Now, Sephardic is a term that can be very misleading because it technically means Spanish. However, the vast majority of people that are Sephardim, that are Spanish Jews, don't necessarily speak Spanish. They may speak Arabic, Greek, Turkish. There are Jews across the Mediterranean, as well as the New World, that were forced out of Spain during the Inquisition and Portugal as well. And they often ended up in many other countries around Europe, but especially in the Mediterranean, which is why you have Sephardic Jews living in the land of Israel, even though they're not Spanish anymore in the sense that they don't speak Spanish and they don't have a especially overt Spanish culture. They are nonetheless considered to be part of that Spanish diaspora that happened after the Inquisition. Mizrahi Jews, on the other hand, is the term that's used for Jews of Middle Eastern origin, and I mean more recent Middle Eastern origin, since obviously Judaism is of Middle Eastern origin if you go back far enough. But the Middle Eastern cultures and types that were not descended from the Sephardic diaspora. Now, this can get confusing because oftentimes, of course, the Sephardim come in and they would intermarry and intermingle their culture and views with the Mizrahi population. So it's not really easy to draw a bright dividing line, but there are many different subgroups. Now, why is all this very important? Well, because there was such a heavy Ashkenazic surge because of the beginning of Zionism being in Europe and the refugee status after World War II, that we now are going to see a counterbalance influx of Jews. Oh, come on. And by counterbalance, I mean massive numbers. somewhere along the order of 750,000 or perhaps even 1,000,000 Jews were over the next couple of decades forcibly evicted or some willingly made aliyah from the countries of the Middle East. Now, some of these are Sephardim, for example, many of the Jews who lived in Turkey, but many of them are Mizrahi, meaning they are full Middle Eastern, recently living communities that trace their lineage and their culture to the Middle Eastern history. As you can see, the numbers of Jews who lived in these countries prior to the establishment of the State of Israel was enormous. This was a mammoth population of Jews throughout the Middle East and North Africa. However, just a few decades later, by 1972, you can see that almost all of them have been forced out of those countries. This is the Mizrahi diaspora that is often not discussed enough in the history of this time period. Although it is fascinating and inspiring the way that they were absorbed into Israel and that they were given a chance to fully become part of this amazing Israeli experience. However, that doesn't mean that everything was a bed of roses. Yes, they found homes, they found work, they became part of Israel and have absolutely made Israel what it is today, greatly enriching it by both culture as well as their own individual strength and contributions. But the interaction between the Sephardi Mizrahi community on the one hand and the Ashkenazi community on the other hand has played a big role in Israel's history since 1948, as far as its internal and domestic politics and culture and societal topics are concerned. What does that mean? Well, it means that for much of the time since 1948, there has been a lot of tension between the Sephardic Mizrahi communities and the Ashkenazic communities. Like I said, the most active communities that fed into the Zionist rebuilding of Israel were Ashkenazi, from Russia, from Romania, from across Europe, and from many of the other countries, such as England or the United States, that may not have sent as many immigrants, but definitely sent a lot of monetary and political support. Those two were predominantly Ashkenazic communities. As such, Israel took on, in its very early days, a predominantly Ashkenazi European style of culture. This was reinforced because the vast majority of the Ashkenazim who were coming to Israel were driven by the Jewish Enlightenment, known as the Haskalah, which means that they were of a particular secular mindset. They were not coming for pure religious motivation. They were, in fact, mostly non-religious, some of them actually atheist, but most religious in a more passive sense. And they were looking to rebuild a nation. They were not looking to rebuild a religion. That was very much different from many of the Sephardic and the Mizrahi communities, for whom religion had been their primary form of attachment to Judaism, and who looked at these European people a little bit askance for how much they had discarded of an active Jewish religious lifestyle. On the other hand, the Ashkenazim were surprised that the Mizrahi and Sephardi did not immediately leap on the national agenda of secular Zionism, not realizing that they had not experienced that same Haskalah, the same enlightenment that had gone through Europe, and just like the non-Jewish neighbors in the Middle East, had not embraced the whole philosophy of the Enlightenment period. And so, of course, they were not secularized in the same way. There was also a lot of bad blood, and I will say where the blame squarely lies, which is on the Ashkenazic shoulders. The Ashkenazim often saw the Middle Eastern Jews and the Sephardic Jews as being antiquated or barbaric. They looked at these people, many of whom were dressed in robes and headdresses that were no different than their Arab neighbors, because it made sense in the climate and the culture, and considered them to be Well, barbaric, the same way that many people from Europe, when they went into other parts of the world, looked at the local population as being out of touch or barbarians. Unfortunately, many Ashkenazic Jews looked the same way at their brothers and sisters from the Sephardic and Mizrahi communities. Now, that doesn't mean they didn't try to help. In some ways, they tried too much to scrub away the culture of the Sephardim and the Mizrahi. But it also did meant that there was some discrimination between the Sephardim towards the other communities. But once you understand and you are, university educated and you have fully appreciated secular bureaucracy, then we'll give you better jobs and will integrate you better into the political system. But for the moment, here, how about if I teach you Hebrew in modern, heavily influenced by European style pronunciation and grammar? How about if we teach you how to enjoy all of our foods, and you should, really become more like us? Obviously, the Sephardim and the Mizrahi found this incredibly patronizing. They had rich and vibrant cultures, incredible scholarship, and people of great talent, and they did not need to be treated like children. Yes, they appreciated being taken in as refugees from the Middle Eastern countries that had kicked them out, often by stripping them of all their property so that they had nothing to come to this new country with. But a little more respect would have helped. And there also has to be admitted that among some of the Ashkenazim, there was an element of racism. The Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews in some communities often were of a darker complexion, often had a culture that more closely resembled a native culture, an indigenous culture. And unfortunately, just like every other religion and every other group and every other nation, among the Israelis, there were racists. There continue to be racists. It is, I think, a small proportion, but it is nonetheless something that has to be admitted. And it took years before Israel properly dealt with that, and continues to deal with the implications to this day. It has taken a long time for greater integration, but it is much further along than it used to be. And you do see Ashkenazic and Mizrahi and Sephardic families marrying together, sharing their culture, compromising on the customs and religious practices. There has been a great deal of progress. But during the early few decades, there is a reason why the politics and society is dominated by the Ashkenazic founders, or at least who felt themselves to be the founders of the modern state. And that needs to be understood and should never be swept under the rug. Additionally, there was also a major political aspect to the early days of Israel that many people who haven't studied this don't remember, because it's been a few decades since it was so prominent, and that was socialism. Now, socialism is very often misunderstood in the United States, sometimes deliberately and pig-headedly, sometimes just because of ignorance. But socialism in Israel was not communism, although, as we discussed, there were voluntary kibbutzim that hewed much closer to a communist outlook. The country itself was socialist in the sense that the government played a large role in the economy. In fact, by 1970, roughly 70% of the population worked either directly for the government or indirectly for the government. So the government was a primary employer and a primary guider of the economy. We're not talking 5-year plans of Russia or communist China, but there was a strong emphasis on government guidance of the economic sectors, of government investment in developing industry, and of heavy taxation to pay for social programming, to make sure that all the refugees from wherever they came could be integrated, and that all of the various industries needed for Israel's development and defense would be properly supported. And that continued up until the 1980s. We'll talk about that change when we talk about what happened. But it's important to recognize that even though it has changed into a more, I don't want to say pure capitalist, a more regulated capitalist structure and less of a socialist structure, it is still the inheritor of many of those early social programs. Israel has universal health care. Israel has strong pensions for the elderly. Israel has good assistance for families with children that are in need. And Israel has a lot of other social welfare programs that are often found in socialist countries. So despite the change to a more capitalistic structure, Israel does still have many of these inherited gifts from its early beginnings. Okay. The other thing we need to know before we dive into the timeline is how the government works. Israel is governed by the Knesset, a parliamentarian system. It is a proportional representative democracy, which means, unlike the United States, there is no District 1 for the Knesset represented by Bob Shapiro. Instead, the Knesset seats, the 120, are divided based upon the national proportion of votes that each political party receives. So if we'll use the American titles of the parties just because it's more familiar. So if the Democrats received 51% of the vote, they would receive 61 seats in the Knesset. And it doesn't matter whether they receive 51% of the vote all in Tel Aviv, the major coastal city, or whether they receive 51% evenly spread throughout the rest of the country. If they get 51% of the total vote from the entire country, they would receive 61 seats, and that would mean they are in charge of the government. Now, this proportional representation means that no one has had a majority for a very long time. In fact, at the moment, getting more than 30% of the vote for any one party is considered a huge party. And crossing that 30% threshold is very, very difficult indeed. Which means at any given time, as I like to point out, 70% of the population disagree with who should be in current charge. That is to say, they would rather their own person be prime minister. But what happens is, since no party has had a straight majority by themselves for decades, it means that you have to have a coalition. You have to have these smaller parties agree that they are going to vote together to make that 61 seat threshold at least, and that they as a group will decide who the prime minister will actually be. So for example, in the current coalition that was formed following the last election, the decision was made to seal the deal that the leader of one of the more medium parties would actually become prime minister first, even though his party did not receive the most votes among all of the parties that are making up the coalition. But it was necessary to get not only him, but other parties on board for him to become prime minister. But to get the larger party on board, it was necessary to promise its leader to be prime minister next, assuming the coalition survives. Because like many parliamentary systems, Israel's government will continue for 5 years unless the current members of the government reject the current government. At any time, any member of the coalition can basically say, we're pulling out. And when they pull out, if they no longer have 61 seats in the Knesset, then time to call a new election and time to see how the votes will be distributed again, and then let's form a new government based upon the new vote. So that's why Israel has had a run of elections over the last few years, because it has been very hard for them to meet that 61 seat threshold and select a prime minister, or to have that prime minister and their government survive for very long. Right now, it's been going relatively well. A little touch and go on a couple issues, and it's unclear whether that's going to continue in the short term or not, or whether it will stabilize. but the current coalition is actually quite interesting and unique. It is made up of parties that are both right-wing, left-wing, centrist type. It also has Arab political parties for the first time in a governing coalition, and with real power to influence the politics of the nation. How long the coalition will last? I am not a Navi, I'm not a prophet, and I will never make a guess on that. But so far, they have actually been holding together and legislating and making laws that seem to be, at least at the moment, satisfying all the partners in the coalition. But as we go through, understand that at any of the different crises or flashpoints, that the change of government was always a possibility if the members of the Knesset, the members of parliament, were unhappy with the way things were currently going. Unlike the United States, where a president or a representative or senator can just wait a couple years and hope that it blows over, in Israel, you could be out of your job as prime minister by next week if the coalition has fallen apart. All right, with that general understanding of some of the major issues in Israel and how things work or sometimes break, let's get down to some of the events. And there is a trap, but it's a decent one that I'm going to play along with, which is the history of Israel since 1948 has been a history of different wars and conflicts. Now, this doesn't mean that that's all that goes on in Israel. And many people get a completely distorted view of how much fighting and danger there really is in Israel, which is a shame, because in general, the rates of violence to the average person not in uniform are very, very low. In fact, lower than many parts of the United States. But Israel has had to respond to and deal with these crises throughout its lifespan, roughly one a decade, more or less. And that has severely shaped and limited some of the other things that it has been trying to do. As such, talking about the different conflicts is often a useful structure for explaining what led up to and what the results were and how that impacted the general society. So despite my general distaste of teaching history, and especially Israel's history, as being nothing more than a series of wars, it is a useful framework, and I beg your indulgence. So the first stop we're going to get to is 1956. And in 1956, Israel invades Egypt to regain access to the Suez Canal and the Gulf of Eilat. For those of you that are geography buffs, you'll know the Gulf of Eilat is the water that comes down out of the south part of Israel, that tip of the Negev that leads down into the Red Sea, and from the Red Sea into the Indian Ocean. And that is, of course, a very vital shipping canal for Israel, and a very important point for both things going out of Israel and things coming into Israel. The Suez Canal is the canal that connects the Mediterranean into the Red Sea and thus into the Indian Ocean. And likewise, this was vital for Israel's economy and survival. Egypt closes access of the Suez Canal and the Gulf of Eilat to Israel, which is a declaration of war. Now, leading up to this, there were already many, many problems across the border between Egypt and Israel. Egypt continued to support and send raiders into Israel since at least 1951. This was a very hot version of the Cold War that would exist in between each of the conflicts between Israel and her neighbors. And Israel was constantly trying to repel and deal with the terrorist attacks across these border raids. Nasser became the leader of Egypt, and one of the first things he did was to nationalize the Suez Canal. Now, this was because Nasser was also anti-colonial to England and France, who had maintained their rule over the Suez Canal, even as they had given autonomy to Egypt. England and France felt that the Suez Canal was too vital for their economy and for the world to be left in the hands of the natives. And yes, this is that kind of mindset back in the 1950s. They also were very eager to retake the canal. At the same time, Nasser has begun an arms race trying to build up national pride by building up a national military that he will use to attack Israel and project Egyptian power into the territory. And Nasser is working very hard to try to become the leader of the Arab world. He will try for much of his life to unify the Arabs, and Israel is very much the centerpiece to his claim for Arab unity, for pan-Arabism, because he believes that Israel is a colonial outpost that needs to be destroyed in order that there can be full Arab autonomy in the region. For all of these reasons, and with British and French encouragement, Israel attacks, giving the British and French an excuse to retake the Suez Canal, because they say, look, there's a war zone, we can't just let this go, we need to step back in, and this is what we told you would happen in the first place. Now, Israel was in some ways not exactly blackmailed into this, but strongly encouraged by England and France. Although, yes, of course, Israel wanted to open itself up to the canal and the Gulf of Eilat, and Israel wanted to stop the cross-border raids. The particular timing was driven because England and France were threatening to withhold arms supplies to Israel unless Israel played along with this international charade. So that is an unfortunate part of the diplomacy of this time. But as I mentioned, Israel did have legitimate reasons to try and reclaim their access to the Suez Canal as well as the Gulf of Eilat. It's just unfortunate that this other layer of diplomacy clouds that time. Israel eventually relinquishes their control of the Sinai Peninsula, and they do so under heavy pressure from the United States, from President Eisenhower at the time, whom the British and French were hoping would stay out of it, but the United States was unwilling to allow this to continue to escalate. For the next approximately 10 years, I said this is about once a decade, there is continued trouble and strife between Israel and the Arab neighbors. As I mentioned last week when we talked about 1948, the Arab nations may not have been very good at unifying or cooperating, but they were absolutely engaged in the idea that Israel needed to be destroyed. And Israel continued to build up their defenses and to build up their capabilities to try and survive. In 1967, Israel launches a preemptive strike. It launches a war, overt military action against the neighbors that are surrounding it, especially in Syria, Jordan, and in Egypt. Now, you might be thinking, well, if you attack first, then that must mean that you're the bad guy. And unfortunately, some people have only that level of sophistication when it comes to analyzing a situation. But Israel had been under constant attack from across the border by the Syrian and Egyptian and Jordanian forces. The Golan in particular, as you can see from the diagram here, which is above Lake Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee in the north of Israel, was an ideal position for artillery fire, which was rained down upon the farms, towns, and villages of the north of Israel with frequent and reckless abandon. This meant that if you lived in the north, you had a good chance of simply being killed while out working in your fields. This was not considered war because, first of all, the war that had begun in 1948 had never stopped. There was only a ceasefire, not an actual truce. And secondly, they didn't move their troops across the border. Instead, they moved them up to the border and fired from there. As you can imagine, Israel was having a difficult time absorbing these attacks without needing to respond. And ultimately, the only response that would be necessary would be to go across the border and stop the people from firing at you. It wasn't something that could be done from a distance. Also in Egypt, those cross-border raids were continuing. And of course, the Jordanians, who shared the long border of what is often referred to as the West Bank, would often fire across that border into Israel as well. So Israel was under constant attack. And in 1967, as Israel saw the mobilization of Arab armies clearly preparing for war, and as they saw the UN peacekeeping troops in the Sinai asked to leave, which they did, and as they saw the closing of the Straits of Tiran down access to the Indian Ocean, which meant there would be no more oil coming in from Iran, and as Jordan and Iraq joined the defense pact, Israel recognized that a war was imminent. The Arab nations had spent 20 years preparing for their next assault on Israel, and it was clear that this was going to happen at any time. Israel also recognized that a combined, coordinated, cohesive attack from all of these other countries would be very difficult for her to repel. But if she were to attack first, to destroy their air forces and to destroy much of their armor, the tanks and artillery, then Israel would be in a much better position for the conflict. Well, this was more than successful. This was an incredibly well-executed strike against those forces, almost completely destroying the air forces of the attacking countries and severely crippling their ground forces as well. And in fact, in 6 days, Israel went on to take not only the West Bank and the Golan Heights, but also all of the Sinai Peninsula and hold them very strong and hold them in a place where, had they wished to continue the press of their aircraft or their ground forces, could have easily gone on to attack or capture Cairo, Damascus, or Amman, the capitals of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. And if we look at the picture of what the results were, well, Israel went from the borders here in the darker shade to now being in a position where her troops were in the lighter shaded territories. Like I said, the Golan, the West Bank, and the entirety, come on, of the Sinai Peninsula. And as you can see, Damascus, Amman, and Cairo are not far off from where that Israel stopped. And Israel stopped not because it was stopped by the forces that it faced, but because it chose to stop. Now, at the end, Israel is controlling the West Bank, the Golan Heights, the Gaza Strip, and the Sinai Peninsula, which I will remind you were controlled by Egypt, meaning the Sinai and Gaza by Egypt. The West Bank was controlled and annexed by Jordan, and the Golan Heights were controlled and abused by Syria. This meant, most importantly for many people, that Jerusalem was unified again. This meant that East Jerusalem, which is where the old city is, the picture that's in my background, was finally accessible to Jews once more. The period between 1948 and 1967 was the first time in thousands of years when Jews were not allowed to go to the old city of Jerusalem. The Jerusalem neighborhood was demolished and trashed by the Jordanians, and Israelis were not allowed to cross the border to visit the old city at all. There was much destruction of Jewish artifacts and Jewish history, and the army was very pleased to be able to secure the city of Jerusalem without any destruction to the holy sites in the process. That was a very important goal, and one that thankfully was carried out very well, despite, of course, the greater risk to life for the soldiers, because they refused to use tanks and artillery in order to retake the old city. It also means that Israel is now in the territory of an additional 750,000 non-Jewish Arab people. some Muslim, some Christian, but all of whom were formerly members of Egypt, Jordan, or Syria. And of course, Israel's size literally triples. Now, the Sinai Peninsula is not considered to be the most pristine neighborhood that everyone would like to live in. It is a desert, but certainly the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and the Golan Heights were considered very good pieces of territory. However, despite being asked to cease and to stop by the international community, which Israel complied with, the attacks across the borders continued. Israel was not able to secure a lasting peace by the conquering of this territory. It did certainly provide an additional buffer zone so that the enemy armies would be amassed along the Sinai Peninsula or the Jordan River, or pushed back away from the heights of Golan, but it did not stop the attacks from continuing across those borders. Which is why only a few years later in 1973, there is an additional attack. This is the last full-scale war, and it is called the Yom Kippur War because it took place on Yom Kippur as part of a deliberate strategy to catch Israel off guard, having followed months and months of false alarms, of readiness drills by the Arab armies to try and drain Israeli readiness and also make them miss the signs of which one would actually be the real war. And 1973 was the hardest war that Israel ever had to fight. Even though, yes, 1948 was incredibly difficult, by 1973, new Soviet technology, which was being fed to its client states in the Middle East, meant that the threat and style of warfare was much more devastating. It also meant that Israel had to come up with new strategies to be able to defend itself successfully. The same techniques that had worked in 1967 were not going to work in 1973. And Israel struggled during the beginning of that war. And basically, the international community sat on its hands. However, as Israel eventually found its footing and was able to turn the tide, then the world powers pushed for a ceasefire. And again, there was leverage being exerted by the West, the US in particular, to force a compliance of a ceasefire from Israel, even though it had now gotten the upper hand in the fight. But this was the last of the full-scale wars and the last time that Israel has engaged in a warfare that was of existential crisis. Unfortunately, Israel is going to continue to have wars and is going to continue to face now existential crisis with the potential rise of nuclear weapons in the hands of the Iranians in particular. But as far as a conventional war goes, 1973 was the last full-scale conventional war that Israel faced against opponents who very much had both the means and the willingness to completely eradicate her society. Now, I mentioned that Israel began as a socialist country and that changed. And one of the things that caused that change to happen was the Yom Kippur War. The Yom Kippur War revealed that Israel was not entirely invulnerable. It also revealed that the labor leaders, that was the political party that had been in charge since 1948, were not infallible, that they could make mistakes and that those mistakes could have huge repercussions. Israel also in the 1970s was facing rising costs and inflation, just like countries around the world. And this opened the door for a new political party to take power called Likud. And this change was not only to change from a left-wing socialist to a right-wing, more free market economy party, but it also changed a lot of the attitudes within Israel as a whole. Much of the government and government companies were privatized, and the government backed off from their role in the economy. Currency trading, the rate at which the shekel was being traded, was opened up to allow it to float more freely. And simultaneously, and very fortunately, the tech boom began near the end of the 1980s. And this has been one of the great blessings of the end of the 20th and beginning of the 21st century that has allowed Israel, which lacks many natural resources and really doesn't even have the population of other countries around the world, to grow her economy through the innovation of many of the people in the country. Israel is a very, very highly educated, last I checked, highest number of PhDs per capita in the world, and has created many things, but more on that. Now, as I mentioned, since 1948, Israel, despite winning war after war after war, continued to face attacks and terrorism on an ongoing basis, not to mention wars. And Israel, of course, wants peace. As I mentioned last week, when the partition of the United Nations was proposed, even though it did not give Israel everything it wanted, Israel was willing to accept it for the sake of having a country that could be at peace. And now in the 1970s, Israel is going to have, finally, another person on the opposite side who is willing to talk about maybe making peace. Anwar Sadat, who was the leader of Egypt, comes together with Prime Minister Menachem Begin under President Carter in 1978 to sign a peace deal with Egypt. This is called the Camp David Accords because it was run at Camp David, the retreat where in the United States where many summits have been held. Now, this peace treaty had two parts. One part dealt with setting up a state for the Palestinians. Unfortunately, that part was never brought to fruition because the Palestinians refused to recognize the treaty and refused to deal or negotiate with Israel. More on that in just a second. The other part, of course, was the more famous and lasting part, was the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt directly. And this peace treaty said that Israel would return the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, and in exchange, Egypt would stop trying to murder them. Now, this is not what is normally considered a fair deal. After all, Israel was giving up one of the only pieces of land in her possession that had natural wealth in the form of oil, and was doing so only on the condition that she would be tolerated as a neighbor, which should be the precondition for any conversation. But Israel was willing to give up that territory, despite its strategic value, for the sake of peace. By removing Egypt from the potential list of attackers, as Egypt was the largest army that Israel faced, this severely limited the chance for any other coalitions of Arab forces to form a successful conventional army that could threaten Israel. So all in all, this was a good deal because it allowed Israel to spend much more of its time focused on peace and developing itself rather than constantly paranoid about that southern border. As good as this was for Israel, and I would also argue as good as it was for Egypt, which also was allowed to redirect much of its spending towards its internal domestic issues and receive generous financial aid from the United States to the tune of billions of dollars each year. Unfortunately, Anwar Sadat faced a lot of criticism from other Arabs as well as people within his own country. And he was assassinated because he made this treaty with Israel. Now, I've mentioned off and on terrorism throughout this discussion, but let's just do a little bit of the highlights. The separate terrorist organization known as the PLO, meaning a separate group that was not being run out of one of the other nation states near Israel, was created by the Arab League in 1964. Now, this was created as a secular nationalistic group. Many people today associate terrorism purely with radical extremist Islam, but unfortunately, terrorism can be secular. And indeed, the first Palestinian terrorist organization that continues to occupy so much of the attention of the world was purely secular. It was fighting for the national rights of Palestinians to retake the entirety of what we would recognize as Israel, from river to sea, as they chant, and to do so at the expense and extermination of the Jews that were living there. Not because they were Jews, but because they were foreigners in their minds. This was a secular nationalistic group. The introduction of radical Islam comes later. Now, Yasser Arafat, who was the leader of the PLO until his death, would organize numerous attacks. Here we can see just between September and December of 1967, 61 different attacks, and in 1968 perpetrate their first hijacking. And this becomes the new normal for Israel and the international world to have to deal with. Bombings, murders, and hijackings throughout Israel and Europe become commonplace in the decades that follow. Other terrorist organizations of note are Hezbollah, which was formed during the Lebanon War, more on that in a second, in 1985, and Hamas, which was founded in 1987. The last two begin that trend towards radical Islam, where their claims of legitimacy are grounded in religious ideals rather than within national aspirations. That, of course, has made things more difficult, as one can compromise on borders, but people have more difficulty compromising on what they believe is righteous or sinful. And that has proven to be an intractable problem until this day. Now, as I mentioned, Lebanon becomes an issue for Israel, but Lebanon really needs a whole discussion of its own history. And please go and learn more about this amazing country and its tragic history. Lebanon had been quite a successful state with its own internal difficulties, but due to this unfortunate sequence of events, Lebanon has continued to suffer until today. So first, you have to understand that the PLO was based in Jordan up until 1970. A large proportion of the Jordanian territory is populated by people that consider themselves to be Palestinians, and they did not recognize the legitimacy of the Hashemite king that ruled over Jordan. And so they staged a coup. Their coup failed. They were not able to kill the Arab king. And as a result, there were massive reprisals, gangs of police rounding people up, summary executions. It was bloody and horrible. And the PLO flees the country of Jordan. Well, they relocate to Lebanon. And in Lebanon, they begin to continue what they've been doing, which is to attack Israel now from Israel's northern border. In 1975, partly as a result of the Palestinian agitation, Lebanon enters a civil war. As the civil war continues, it means there is even less control from anything like a central government to stop the PLO from attacking Israel across that northern border. As such, in 1978, Israel attacks not Lebanon, but the PLO in Lebanon. Of course, if you are Lebanese, that is difficult to distinguish between. If someone was attacking a group of people in Washington State that was, or someone in Washington State was attacking people in Vancouver, I could understand why the US government would be upset if the Canadian Army attacked Washington State to put a stop to it. Of course, if the American government had been completely ignoring those attacks and in many places winking and nodding, allowing them to continue, maybe it wouldn't be that surprising that there would be a cross-border attack in retaliation to defend that territory. The fighting continues back and forth, and in 1982, it flares up again, and Israel assaults the PLO all the way as far as Beirut, the capital city of Lebanon. The PLO will flee after this attack and end up in Tunisia, where Israel will subsequently have to attack them again. But Israel remains in southern Lebanon to try and secure it, to keep it from becoming a source of more attacks and hostility until the year 2000. As you can track from the timeline, that is during this period that Hezbollah gets their growth and gets backing from Iran in order to carry on terrorist attacks from Lebanon into Israel. Iran, having had its own Islamic fundamentalist revolution, though it didn't start as an Islamic revolution in 1979, becomes a great supporter of Islamic terrorism around the world. Just a little bit of a map to understand what we're talking about. Israel is here in the south, and Israel moved up and occupied a territory up to the Litani River in order to maintain a buffer between the terrorists in Lebanon and the citizens of Israel. In 2000, as mentioned, Israel unilaterally withdraws, deciding that it no longer needs that buffer zone, is rewarded by more attacks and continued violence coming across the border. So when people say that if Israel merely withdraws, then there will be an end to violence, have not really been tracking the history very well. Israel has withdrawn in many cases, and the only time that it has been a successful end to violence has been the peace treaty with Egypt. Unfortunately, across the other borders where Israel has stepped back, it has been greeted with additional violence. Before we get into that additional violence, just a little bit of something to lighten things up. Israel is often called Innovation Nation. It is second in the world for the people of percent with college degrees. I had forgotten that I had to update that. Like I mentioned, the exporting of intelligence, of software design and things that are intangible that began in the 1980s has been an incredible boon for Israel. You can't sell natural resources if you don't have it, but you can absolutely sell innovation. And Israel is a world leader in agricultural, military, medical, robotic, and computer innovations. If you have a cell phone, you're using something made by Israel. If you are using many computer chips, that is something that has been perfected by Israel. Many agricultural systems were perfected in Israel. It is something that has gifted a great many of the innovations of the 20th and 21st century to the world. Israel is usually in the top 2 or 3 countries to file patents in the United States. And according to the Bloomberg Innovation Report in 2017, the most recent one I had, Israel ranks 10, putting it ahead of the United Kingdom, China, Canada, France, and Norway, which is incredible for a country of its small size. Not everybody works in the technology field, although it feels that way sometimes when you talk to people in Israel, but it is a very important part of their economy. Back to the violence. Despite this growing affluence in Israel and the continuation of its inventions, despite the peace treaty that has been struck with Egypt, despite driving the PLO out of the neighboring Lebanon so that it is much harder for them to attack Israel, there continues to be waves of terrorism. And these different waves at the high mark are called an intifada. So the first intifada is marked between 1987 and 1991 or 1993, depending upon definitions. And this is a wave of direct violence and disruption of terrorism in no other terms. Many will attribute it to a frustration with the situation, remembering that they still are unable to have a full independent state because they are unwilling to negotiate with Israel demanding that part of that negotiation, just like Egypt, is that they will accept that Israel can continue to exist. The Palestinians refused to accept that. Indeed, many Palestinians to this day refused to discuss the idea of any Israel allowed to continue in any shape or form anywhere within its current borders. And that is a problem when trying to actually make peace. Israel is also getting better and better at stopping this violence, and this is causing a great deal of trouble. Also during this time is the beginning of the use of non-uniformed combatants, using people that are not wearing an army uniform, but instead look like a civilian, oftentimes very young, so that when Israel engages in violence to stop this, they can then point to these casualties as being innocent casualties rather than people engaged in violence. Unfortunately, on top of the human toll that all of this takes on both sides is also the loss of decades worth of potential trust building. Any peace that will eventually come between the Israelis and the Palestinians will need to be built up over trust. And unfortunately, this wave of violence and the second Intifada, which follows, and the other Gaza outbreaks, which follow, continues to prevent that trust from being built, and instead only creates more heartache, more pain, more bitterness that makes it harder to move into that next step. Despite that, in 1993, there was an attempt to bridge the gap, what was called the Oslo Accords. Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin, the prime minister of Israel at the time, worked together with President Bill Clinton to try and come together and have a framework that will begin the process towards peace. The Palestinians officially recognize Israel's right to exist. Israel officially recognizes the Palestinian legitimate and political rights, and begin a process of phased withdrawal of Israeli forces and the creation of a Palestinian government. At the same time, or shortly thereafter, Israel is able to conclude a peace treaty with Jordan, negotiating things like water rights, which are incredibly important in this part of the world, defense cooperation, since Jordan is not interested in terrorism any more than Israel is, remembering, of course, the 1970 coup, and Jordan retains its historic, as they call it, role in administering the Muslim sites in Jerusalem. As Jordan had annexed the West Bank, they had taken control of the Muslim holy sites in Jerusalem, and Israel allows them to continue in that role in order to avoid any antagonism among the Muslim world. But that doesn't stop the second Intifada in 2000, when once again Yasser Arafat walks away from the continued negotiations of Camp David, and Ariel Sharon, then in opposition, goes to the Temple Mount, trying to show that he should be allowed to be there, as indeed he should be allowed. Doesn't mean it was sensible, but it certainly was his right. And this creates a new wave of violence, and many arguing that, in fact, it was already prepared and staged by Yasser Arafat, merely waiting for something like Sharon's visit to give him an excuse to rally people to attack. Having found that terrorism often gets him what he wants, this would be true to form. Unfortunately, this creates more suffering and more terrorism, in particular waves of bombings of cafes and buses. And I can tell you from having lived in Israel for a year during this time, it was a nightmare, and something that has left a bitter taste in the mouth of many Israelis who say, look, we were on the road to peace. Oslo had come. We were pulling back from different places. This was entirely unnecessary. There are many books written about Arafat's decision to unleash this violence, and I'm not here to rehash our armchair quarterback, but it is something that must be understood if you're going to understand the continued difficulty in reaching another stage of agreement. In particular, I am sorry. I thought I had my phone on mute. In particular, Gaza is a sore point for obvious reasons. But one thing you should understand is that in 2005, Israel left Gaza. Israel evacuated all the Israelis in Gaza who had taken up residence there, and Israel also removed all of its soldiers from the borders of Gaza. And what happened afterwards was essentially a civil war between Hamas and the PLO. The Gaza citizens eventually elected Hamas as they were very unhappy with the PLO's governance and corruption. And that election in 2007 is the last election Gaza has been allowed to have. Hamas has prohibited any new elections, and continually engages in acts of violence against any opposition within its territory. Hamas also begins launching rockets across the border, as do other terrorist groups within the Gaza Strip. Israel retaliates and eventually puts an embargo on the Gaza Strip in order to prevent more weapons or military supplies from entering. This has made life very difficult for the citizens of Gaza, and that is something that Israel and I personally deeply regret. But until violence is brought to an end, I really struggle to see exactly what Israel should do. The idea of sitting back and allowing rockets to rain down on your population while allowing new arms, munitions, and supplies to come in simply is suicidal. Not only because you'd be allowing your own citizens to be murdered, but no government would ever be able to stand against a vote of no confidence if they simply said, well, we'll just let this happen because we don't want to make anyone upset. It's simply impossible, and no other country in the world would ever be expected to sit back and allow that to happen either. Which brings me to the end, which is, where do we go from here? Well, as far as the peace process goes, we need to have recognition of Israel as a Jewish state. This is a topic, because this is usually meant as code for saying the Palestinians must give up their claim to a right of return. This is a tension. Palestinians are currently claiming that all descendants from the multiple generations that have come since 1948 should be allowed to return into the land of Israel itself, not West Bank and Gaza, but Haifa, Tel Aviv, any of the main cities of Israel. They should be allowed to move in and reclaim their own property, full stop. This would, of course, indelibly change Israel, and I believe be the end of democracy in Israel as well. The same way we saw an election in Gaza and the election in the West Bank institute have one vote and then no more. This would be the short response. But in the meantime, we also have to worry about who will control what part of Jerusalem. And of course, the Israelis that are living over the Green Line, which is that border that separates Israel from the West Bank. Palestinian sovereignty and autonomy is a major issue. How much control will they have over their own borders? How much control will they have over their own security? And what assurances and cooperation will Israel need in order to feel comfortable and safe? And of course, there is a question of whether Israel would ever annex portions of the West Bank the same way that they have officially annexed the Golan Heights, as well as the portion immediately around the old city of Jerusalem. There are no simple answers to any of this, because Israel knows it must eventually reach an agreement with her Palestinian neighbors, and the Palestinian neighbors are beginning to realize that eventually they will have to reach an agreement with a permanent state of Israel, because they are not going to find it gone. And this has been especially sped up in the last few years as more Arab nations have begun to say that they are not going to force a resolution beyond simple dignity and right for Palestinians within their own territories of the West Bank and Gaza, something that Israel has also said it is willing to support with a bilateral negotiated peace settlement. But reaching that point, getting to that final resolution, it continues to elude, and it is painful to watch, and something that should continue to be at the forefront of our prayers to hope that it will eventually be resolved, as we say, bimhira v'yameinu, speedily and in our days. And that is where we're going to finish for tonight. So I hope everybody is doing well, does well. And if you see any connection or parallels between what Israel has had to endure and what the Ukraine is having to endure at the moment, that is not coincidental. Unfortunately, it is far too often that these types of things repeat themselves if they are allowed to be repeated. Take care, everyone, and be well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Good night.
Have a good night. Thank you.